The dogman hit the riverbank at a dead sprint and did not slow down when it reached the water. That was the first thing that told me it was not running from me. A bear hitting moving water at that speed would have either stopped or turned. A wolf pack pushes across water, but it checks the opposite bank first. Whatever cleared that bank in the dark cleared it because it had somewhere specific to be, moving fast in a direction it had already decided on, and what was behind it was the reason for the speed. I know elk country. I know predator behavior. I know what an animal looks like when it is hunting and what it looks like when it is the one being hunted. I had been sitting in that drainage for 4 days before the night everything came through, and what I watched from that hillside for the better part of an hour told me things about the food chain in the Bitterroot that I have been trying to work out ever since. My name is Garrett Voss. I have been hunting elk in the mountains of western Montana for over 20 years. Before that, I hunted with my father in the same country, and before that with my grandfather, who was the one who taught me that the Bitterroot holds things that the wildlife biologists have not finished cataloging. That the country up past the forks of the drainage is older than the maps we use to navigate it, and that a man who pays attention out there will eventually see something that he will spend the rest of his life wishing he could unsee, or if he is honest about it, wishing he could see again. My grandfather died in 2009. He was the person I would have called the morning after what I am about to describe. He was the one person in my life who would have listened to the full account without interrupting and without the specific look that people give you when they are deciding whether to believe you. He had his own account from the same country, from a hunt in 1974 that he only described to me twice in his life, and both times he described it the same way, which is how you know a man is telling the truth about something he saw. The details do not change. He is gone and I cannot call him, and that absence has been sitting alongside this account for 3 years in a way that has made the account harder to carry than it might otherwise have been. I want to talk about that before I talk about the night, because the emotional weight of what I am about to describe is not separable from the fact that the person who most needed to hear it is the person who cannot. The hunt that year was in late September solo, which is how I have hunted most of my adult life. I go in with a pack frame and food for 10 days, and I do not come out until I have an animal or the food runs out. The drainage I was in is one I have hunted for 15 years. Upper Bitterroot country, north-facing slopes, deep timber on the ridges with open benches above the timberline where the elk feed in the mornings. Not a place I will name more specifically than that because it is a place I still hunt, and I have no interest in it becoming a destination for people with cameras looking for something that may or may not show itself on any given night. Day 4. I had located a bull on the evening of day 2, a good one, working a series of wallows in the upper drainage, and I had spent day 3 getting into position for a morning shot and losing the wind at the worst possible moment. The bull had been gone by the time the light was good enough to shoot, and I had spent day 4 working back into position for another attempt in the evening. By late afternoon, I was on a north-facing hillside above a small creek bottom, glassed in on a bench about 400 yards above me where I expected the bull to appear out of the timber edge at last light. That is how I ended up on that hillside when the dogmen came through. The first one I heard before I saw it. Not a vocalization, movement. The specific sound of something large moving through the brush on the opposite side of the creek at a pace that was not browsing and not casual travel. Fast, purposeful, in a direction parallel to the creek rather than across it. I put the binoculars on the brush line and tracked the movement by the shaking of the alder tops for maybe 30 seconds before the animal broke cover onto the gravel bar. I thought it was an elk. The scale was right for a large cow, maybe 6 feet at the shoulder, heavily built. But it was moving on 2 legs, not rearing up the way a bear does when it wants height. running on two legs at a pace that covered the gravel bar in seconds, arms pumping, upper body forward, the specific biomechanics of a running biped that I could not reconcile with any animal that belongs in a Montana drainage. Dark fur, close and thick. The head, and I had the binoculars on it for a clear 3 seconds before it hit the water. The head was canine. Not a suggestion of canine. Unambiguously canine. Elongated snout, ears back against the skull the way a dog pins its ears when it is running hard. The heavy jaw structure that no bear or primate produces. It cleared the creek in 2 strides and was up the near bank and into the brush below my position before I had fully processed what I had seen. Then the second one came through. Same line of travel, same pace, maybe 40 seconds behind the first. Bigger. Noticeably bigger, the difference you see between a mature bull elk and a mature cow when they are side by side. Same dark fur, same running gait. It hit the gravel bar at full speed and I watched it cross and climb the bank and then it was gone. I stayed absolutely still. I have spent enough time in predator country to know that when 2 large animals are moving fast in the same direction with that kind of urgency, there is something behind them. A grizzly will push elk in that manner, not chasing them, just displacing them with its presence, moving through its territory in a direction that intersects their range and persuading them to get out of the way. I waited. The third one came through 6 minutes later, slower than the first 2, not walking, still moving with purpose, but the pace had dropped from a sprint to a controlled fast trot. The difference between an animal that is running for its life and one that is running because staying in place is no longer an option. It crossed the gravel bar and I got a longer look, 8 seconds, maybe 10, long enough to see the size clearly. This one was the biggest of the 3, and the way I can give you a sense of the scale is this. The alder brush along the near bank of that creek runs about 6 feet tall in that section. The animal that crossed in front of me cleared the top of that brush line with its shoulders when it climbed the bank. The head was above the brush entirely. The hair on that third one was different from the first 2. Paler on the chest and lower abdomen, darker across the back and shoulders in a way that reminded me of the counter-shading pattern you see in large predators. Wolves, mountain lions. Darker on top to break up the silhouette against the sky. Lighter underneath. I do not know if that is relevant. I am just telling you what I saw. The third one disappeared into the brush below my position. I waited another 15 minutes without moving. Nothing else came through. Whatever had pushed those 3 animals down. That drainage had either stopped its pursuit or was moving on a different line than the creek bottom. Here's the part that I want to be careful about, because it is the part where my account shifts from physical description to interpretation, and I want to be clear about which is which. I have thought about what was behind those animals for 3 years. Not obsessively. I am not a man who has a lot of patience for obsession. But consistently in the way that an unresolved question sits at the back of a person's thinking and surfaces at odd moments. Driving. In that period before sleep when the mind is loose enough to let things in that it holds at arm's length during the day. The question is not what the animals were. I have been honest with myself about what I saw on that gravel bar since the morning after it happened, when I replayed the sightings in the clear light of day and could not find a single element of what I had seen that fit any known species. Dogmen, bipedal canines. Whatever name you want to use, the physical description is consistent with accounts that go back to the lumberjacks in Wexford County, Michigan in 1887. Consistent with everything Linda Godfrey documented in Wisconsin over 30 years. Consistent with accounts from the Ojibwe and other peoples who knew this country long before anyone thought to write a field guide to its wildlife. That question has an answer. The question I cannot resolve is what pushed them. 3 dogmen moving at that pace in that direction with that specific quality of urgency, not panic but not comfort. were not browsing and were not traveling casually between range areas. Something had persuaded them that being in that drainage in the dark was a worse option than the expenditure of that speed in a new direction. And in my experience, the animals that produce that kind of displacement are the ones at the top of whatever hierarchy operates in the terrain where the displacement happens. I am not going to speculate beyond that. I do not have enough information to speculate usefully, and I have a strong preference for not saying things I cannot support with what I actually observed. What I observed was 3 dogmen running south through a Montana drainage at full speed on a cold September night, and the absence of whatever was behind them, and the quality of the dark that followed after they were gone. That dark was different from the dark before. I do not know a better way to say it than that. Before they came through, the drainage was doing what a drainage does in the evening. Settling down, the day birds going quiet, the owls starting up, the small mammal activity beginning along the creek. After they were gone, the drainage was silent in a way that September drainages in the Bitterroot are not silent. Not an immediate, startled silence, a sustained, deliberate silence. The kind that tells you the other animals in the area have received information that they are taking seriously. I stayed on that hillside until I could not see the opposite bank anymore. Then I climbed down carefully in the dark, following the drainage south to where I had left my camp. And I did the things you do when you get back to camp. Hung my pack, sorted my gear, ate something I do not remember, lay in my bag, and stared at the tent fabric for a long time. I did not sleep much. Not because I was afraid exactly, or not only because of that, because my grandfather should have been on the other side of a fire from me right then, and I should have been telling him what I had seen, and he should have been telling me what he saw in 1974. We should have been putting those 2 accounts together and seeing what they added up to. That conversation existed somewhere that I do not have access to anymore, and the weight of that absence was, on that particular night, heavier than the weight of what I had watched cross the creek. Before I get to the morning, I want to go back to something I said earlier about my grandfather, because his account from 1974 is part of what I was sitting with in that tent, and it is relevant to what I found when the light came up. He had been hunting the same general region, a drainage 2 forks north of where I was sitting. He was in his late 30s at the time, already an experienced elk hunter, a man who had been going into that country since he was a teenager with his own father. He described it to me twice, once when I was about 16 and once a few years before he died. And both times the core of it was the same. He had been glassing a bench above the timber when he saw something cross an opening on the far ridge. Upright, dark, moving fast, gone before he could fully process what he was looking at. He had spent the better part of the following day working across to that ridge to find the crossing point, and what he found in a patch of soft ground in the timber was a track that he described as longer than his own boot, and wider across the toes than anything he could account for. He made a plaster cast. He kept it in his shop for decades, on a shelf between his reloading press and a jar of elk teeth he had collected over the years. After he died, I looked for it. It was gone. Whether he got rid of it himself at some point or whether it was thrown out with other things in the shop, I do not know. And I have thought about that more than I should have. What he told me both times he described the encounter was that the track had told him 2 things. First, that what made it was considerably heavier than any bear he had encountered in that country, based on the depth of the impression in soil that he knew from years of tracking deer and elk had a certain resistance to compression. Second, that the track showed a bipedal stride pattern, not a bear walking on all 4s, not a bear pushing upright for a moment to see over brush. A walking upright stride, heel to toe like a person, but in dimensions that no person produces. He never saw the animal itself clearly, just the movement on the far ridge and the track in the soft ground. And he told me that in 40 more years of hunting that country, he never saw a sign of it again in the specific drainage where he found the track, but that he had the consistent feeling in the upper sections of the country, past a certain elevation, past a certain point in the forks, that he was in terrain that something else had a prior claim to. He said it was not a feeling of danger exactly, more like the feeling you get when you walk into a room where two people have just finished an argument. The air is different. You are not the reason it is different, but you register it. I had always taken his account seriously because he was not a man who embellished, and because the physical evidence he described, a plaster cast he made himself from a track in Montana soil in 1974, was not the kind of thing a person fabricates. It was too specific and too unspectacular. If he was going to invent something, he would have invented a cleaner story. What he described was confusing and partial and ultimately unresolved. And that is exactly what real accounts of this kind sound like. What he saw on that far ridge in 1974 and what I watched cross the gravel bar 3 years ago are from the same animal. I do not mean the same individuals. In 50 years, 2 different drainages. I mean the same species, the same behavior profile, the same category of thing operating in the same general range of mountain country in western Montana across generations of my family's hunting there. That continuity is something I have been turning over. The Bitterroot watershed is roughly 2.5 million acres of federal wilderness and national forest. The upper drainages in the sections I am talking about see perhaps a few dozen hunters per season, mostly in a window of 6 to 8 weeks. The rest of the year, that country is as close to genuinely empty of human presence as anywhere in the lower 48. Whatever uses those drainages has had 100 years of relatively undisturbed time to establish range patterns and behavioral protocols in terrain that almost nobody enters. It would be stranger if nothing had established itself there than if something had. The next morning I packed out, not because I felt unsafe staying. I had thought about that carefully lying in the tent, and concluded that whatever had been moving through that drainage the night before was not interested in my camp, that whatever it was had other concerns entirely. I packed out because the elk I had been hunting had left the drainage. They were gone by first light, the bench above the timber completely empty. No tracks in the frost. No fresh rubs on the timber edge, nothing. They had left sometime in the night and they had not come back. Before I packed my tent, I spent an hour working the gravel bar where the animals had crossed. The creek had dropped slightly overnight in the cold and the bar was well defined, and in the sections of fine silt at the upper and lower edges of the gravel I found what I was looking for. Tracks. Not perfect. Gravel does not hold detail the way mud does, but clear enough in the silt margins to measure and document. I carry a folding ruler and a small notebook on every hunt for logging sign, and I used both. The clearest impression I found was from the third animal, the largest one, at the point where it had climbed the near bank out of the water. Silt at the base of the bank, sheltered from the overnight wind by the bank itself, had preserved a left foot impression that I spent 20 minutes photographing from every angle with my phone before I measured it. 14.5 inches from heel to the longest toe. 7.25 inches across the widest point of the forefoot. 4 distinct toe impressions with claw marks forward of each toe at a spacing I have never seen in any bear print, too even and too closely grouped for a bear's splayed forefoot. For comparison, a mature male grizzly in Montana leaves a front track roughly 9 to 11 inches long and 7 to 9 inches wide. A 400-pound black bear leaves a track maybe 7 to 8 inches in length. What I was looking at was in a different category entirely, and the depth of the impression in that silt. I pressed my own boot into the same material next to the track to calibrate. Suggested an animal at least twice my own weight on a single foot strike. I photographed the comparison. I photographed the track next to my ruler. I wrote the measurements in my notebook. And then I packed the tent and started south down the drainage. About 2 miles below the crossing site, I found the second thing worth noting. In a flat section of trail where the drainage widened, in soft ground that had been damp from a spring seep, there were tracks from all three animals overlapping in a section about 30 feet long. A convergence point where the three lines of travel had come together before they split again, heading in slightly different directions up the south slope of the drainage. 3 distinct sets, 3 distinct sizes, all showing the same bipedal stride, all in the same substrate and therefore comparable. I measured stride lengths. The smallest animal, 52 inches between successive left foot impressions. The middle animal, 58 inches. The largest, 64 inches. A stride length of 64 inches corresponds in human bipedal biomechanics to a running height of approximately 7.5 to 8 feet. That is not a number I am guessing at. Stride-to-height ratios in bipedal locomotion are well documented in forensic gait analysis, and the relationship is consistent enough at running speed to give a reliable height estimate. I stood in that flat section for a long time, looking at those tracks and then looking at the slope they had gone up, and then I kept walking south. That told me enough about what had moved through that country after the Dogman to make the decision for me. I have told this account to 4 people in 3 years. My brother, who hunts the same country and who listened carefully and then said he thought I should keep it to myself for a while. A man I have known for 20 years who guides elk in the same general region, who went quiet when I described the third animal crossing the bank and then said he had seen track evidence in the upper drainage 3 years prior that he had not been able to explain and had not told anyone about. My wife, who believes me because she knows I do not embellish and because she has spent enough time watching me in the field to understand that I am not a man who misidentifies things he looks at through quality glass from a stable position. And now you. I am not going to tell you what to do with this information. I am not going to tell you the Bitterroot is dangerous or that you should stay out of the upper drainage or any of the other things that turn an account like this into a warning that people can choose to dismiss. What I will tell you is that the country up past the forks is exactly what my grandfather said it was. Older than the maps, holding things the biologists have not finished accounting for and worth paying attention to, in a way that most people who go in there are not paying attention. The question of what pushed those animals south through the drainage on a September night in western Montana does not have an answer that I can give you. I do not have one. I have been in that country for 2 decades and I was not prepared for what I saw on that gravel bar. And what I was even less prepared for was the specific quality of the silence that came after. It is still out there, whatever it was. The drainage does not change because one man saw something he could not explain and packed out at first light. The elk come back. The bears work the berry slopes in August. The country does what country does, and on some nights, in the drainages above the forks, 3 dogmen remember a direction they needed to run, and whatever was behind them remembers that it let them go. If you hunt the northern Rockies, Montana, Idaho, the Wyoming border country, and you have come back from a drainage with something you could not account for, leave it in the comments. Not just dogman sightings, track evidence, animal displacement patterns. The specific quality of silence I described. If you have felt that in country you know well, I want to hear about it. Subscribe if you want to follow where this goes. There is more of this country than any one account can cover. And the people who spend time in it are the only ones who are going to put the full picture together.